So that should be about 2:10 in Samoa. Okay. So thank you everyone and welcome to this third session of the ABS webinar that SPREP is hosting in partnership with the UNSW, University of New South Wales and ABS Initiative. As you know, we have a project funded by the GEF, implemented by UN Environment and executed by SPREP from Samoa. We have a project in 14 Pacific Island countries. And this is our third webinar today. We have had 2 more webinars before this. We talked about technical things happening in countries in terms of legislation, in terms of capacity building, in terms of what are the interim measures that countries can take whilst implementing access and benefit sharing measures. Colleagues, this year is a very important year because we are marking 10th year anniversary of the Nagoya implementation. And it's more so special for the Pacific because we have people with us today in this webinar who had been involved in negotiation and also in helping the Pacific Island countries to ratify and implement measures on access and benefit sharing. So with those words, I would like to welcome everybody to this webinar. Also welcoming some of our key partners as well as our experts from the region. And my colleagues, Easter, Amanda, and I'm sure Clark would be joining us sometime during the webinar, or otherwise we have a message from him. At this point, I would like to give the floor to Amanda just to make an opening remark on behalf of the SPREP team before we go further. Amanda.
Thank you, Raul. Lovely to see everyone. So this year, the 10th year anniversary of the Nagoya Protocol, we have organised, there are many small-scale celebrations being held across the globe to mark this anniversary, although much has been affected by the COVID pandemic. Similarly, at SPREP, we are organising a webinar to celebrate the Nagoya Protocol on the theme, A Decade of Nagoya Protocol Journey in the Pacific. In this webinar, we will highlight the achievements of the Pacific as a region on the implementation of the protocol, our shared challenges and goals and aspirations as we move into the post-2020 era. Major highlights, which will be discussed in detail during this webinar, include development of the ABS policy and legislation framework for member countries, development of national roadmap for implementation of ABS, national, sub-regional and regional capacity building workshops and training, access to technical assistance and expertise on matters pertaining to ABS in the region, including a roster of experts. And finally, communication and awareness materials, including translated materials, to be used nationally by countries. The COVID-19 pandemic has put the Regional Access and Benefit Sharing Project, implemented by UN Environment and SPREP, under significant limitations, particularly with capacity building measures. While SPREP continued to identify solutions and technical assistance that was rendered remotely during the period between February and June this year, nevertheless, the new normal meant that all countries, including the executing entity, had to be proactive in adopting the new changing way of doing business. The project continued to provide remote assistance through online modalities such as webinars and encouraging the use of online resources and tools developed by its collaborators and partners for maximisation of benefits during the current situation. As a result of the pandemic, many scheduled national capacity building workshops and 2 regional ABS training workshops had to be postponed or cancelled. These workshops and capacity building measures put emphasis on the need for mobilization of strategies, including policies and legislation, to help countries to adopt interim measures as we draw them to full implementation of the protocol in the Pacific. It has been my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, and I now hand over to Raul and James, who will lead you through this session today.
Thank you, Amanda. I think you've basically set the scene in terms of what we're going to hear about. At this point, I would also like to welcome our colleague from CVD office, who's joining us to this regional webinar for the Pacific. So welcome on board. Now I would like to give it to Professor Daniel Robinson just to make a short remark, and followed by that we'll have a video message by Dr. Andreas from ABS Initiative.
Thank you, Rahul. Yeah, so Amanda said it very well that it's been a very difficult year, and unfortunately we haven't been able to visit the countries this year. We did have many activities planned. I know at the start of the year we were coming to Fiji for a capacity building workshop, and there were plans to visit Cook Islands and Vanuatu and Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea as well. Unfortunately, this year has been really difficult in that regard, but we're glad to be able to still reach out to you virtually online through these webinars, which I think has been really good. And it's been good to hear from a lot of you by email. We've stayed in touch with many of the countries throughout this process, and commenting on legislation or roadmaps or permit processes and those sorts of things relating to ABS under the Nagoya Protocol. It's really exciting to talk to you in relation to the 10 years since Nagoya. I was actually in Nagoya for the negotiations. I think Jeffrey, who's there, was there as well. And then we had workshops shortly afterwards in the Pacific in Nandi and Suva, I think. So I remember those shortly afterwards. So I've been here for the journey, and I've really enjoyed the process of working with the Pacific countries. I particularly enjoyed working with the SPREP team, and I think we've had a really fruitful collaboration over the years. So I really appreciate SPREP's support and organisation of this workshop as well. And I do just also want to flag, I really enjoyed the Pacific Nature workshop just last week, which SPREP also co-organised, and had some great sessions on traditional knowledge. So I will hand over to James now. He has a short video from Andreas, who's the global manager for the ABS initiative. As you know, the ABS initiative is funded by the European Union and the German government, and implemented, UNSW in Sydney helps implement that project. So Andreas had a few words to say, if James can run that little video. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. James?
I think the sound's not working, James, on our side.
James, I reckon it could be because you're muted, and so you need to tick the little box when you share your screen saying use computer audio. Might work. That is from my 45 sessions of running the conference.
Thank you, Amanda. Lessons learned.
Definitely.
Sorry about that, guys. Okay. Just,
Can you see when you do share screen and then you tick a box at the bottom saying allow computer audio or something?
Is it better? Can you guys hear that?
It started, there was some sound, hit play, it seems to have...
Something scribbled.
Yeah, so James, what you could do is you could go to Daniel's presentation, and then we can come back to the message of Dr. Andreas. And colleagues, sorry about that. That's technical glitches, something that we can't avoid at this time, but my team is fixing that, and we should be able to get that running soon. Daniel, would you like to go on your presentation now?
Yeah, that's fine. That's okay. Thanks, Thanks, James. I was thinking about what haven't I spoken to the Pacific countries about, I think we've covered so much over the years in terms of looking at the Nagoya Protocol and ABS systems and contracts and all those sorts of things. We talked about digital sequence information in the last webinar, and also issues relating to pandemics and genetic resources internationally. So I thought I would talk, and one of the things that's come up is there's been questions about ABS. There's been quite a bit of discussion about the difference between systems. For example, what the EU, the Europe countries have put in place. I've just lost the screen. Are you able to put the slides back, James? James, are you able to put those? Yeah.
I think there's a bandwidth problem for James.
Yeah, there must be. I'll just see if James can get it back up. If not, I can probably just, if you give me a second, I could share it. Just bringing it up on my screen. I can't share screen.
There we are.
There we go. Okay. So yes, I'm going to talk a bit about different types of ABS systems and different scope of criterion relating to access and utilization. And so there's been a bit of difference in the way different countries have interpreted this. And I think a lot of this discussion started with the way the EU set out their regulations. So I'll talk a bit about the EU's access and benefit sharing laws, Switzerland, and a few other countries, just to give a few different examples. Can you click through, James? Next slide. So one of the things that's been discussed is about ABS triggers for the access and benefit sharing, and this question of temporal scope. So the Nagoya Protocol doesn't really say whether it should apply to genetic resources and traditional knowledge access before its entry into force, but then utilized afterwards. So what happens is that a lot of genetic resources have obviously been shared with other countries, with researchers, and they're held in gene banks and herbariums. But sometimes what happens then is there's new types of utilization on the genetic resources that were already shared before entry into force of the protocol or the Convention on Biodiversity. Now, many developing countries have said that they would like the interpretation of the Nagoya Protocol to recognize new types of utilization of the resources, and often in their legislation they have included text that specifies that new types of utilization of resources that may be held already in existing gene banks or may have been accessed before the Nagoya Protocol should also require a benefit sharing agreement and permits. Now the debate was about, there's a principle within international law about non-retroactivity, because it's very hard to apply law in general, including international law and legal principles in reverse. So in this regard, the European legislation has taken a very specific sort of view on this, and I'll come to that in a minute. So each individual country has come to sort of their own conclusions on this, because the protocol left this ambiguous. And I think we've seen with the Nagoya Protocol that many different parts of the text are often left deliberately ambiguous, so countries have scope to consider this. But it's worth considering in terms of your own legislation and policy on access and benefit sharing, to ask this question basically: is the trigger for the access and benefit sharing and the setting up of mutually agreed terms is that the accessing of the genetic resource, and it might be and associated traditional knowledge as well, or the new utilizations of the resource and associated traditional knowledge. And I think some of the legislation that we've seen in the Pacific has a mixture of this actually, and I think that's actually an interesting approach. James, can you click the next slide? Now, the same, I guess, can be said to apply to thinking about associated traditional knowledge. So procedures relating to associated traditional knowledge is another area where there's slightly different interpretations in the laws that have been set up around the world. So the Article 6 and 7 use the phrase, in accordance with domestic law, countries can frame the access procedures held for genetic resources held by Indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as associated traditional knowledge. So this obviously provides a bit of flexibility in terms of the language, but then the protocol also says each party shall take measures for the prior informed consent and approval and involvement of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And so there's been some slightly different interpretations of the way this could be introduced into national legislation, which I think we'll see in some of the other, in some of the legislation around the world. Next slide, please, James. So the European Union's put forward a narrow interpretation of the temporal scope of what the Nagoya Protocol was saying of their access and benefit sharing legislation. So access is defined as the acquisition of genetic resources or of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources in a party to the Nagoya Protocol. So only the physical access to a genetic resource or associated traditional knowledge in the country of origin can trigger ABS obligations within the EU. And this is only if such resources have been accessed in a country of origin of a party to the Nagoya Protocol after the protocol has entered into force in both countries. So this is sort of the interpretation that most people have taken from the European legislation. And it says that no due diligence obligations of users are required if such resource was acquired before this time, even if new research and development was taking place on the resource after it came into force. So this is a very particular non-retroactive approach to access and benefit sharing. And in terms of thinking about the triggers for the access and benefit sharing procedures. Next slide, James. Now, South Africa has a very broad set of legislation. So you can imagine South Africa has a very different approach. They ratified the Nagoya Protocol in 2011 and in 2015 amended its regulations on bioprospecting and access and benefit sharing in relation to the acts that they have. And the regulation clearly takes a utilization approach to temporal scope, as they do not refer to access permits, but to bioprospecting permits. And within bioprospecting, they define any research on or development or application of Indigenous biological resources for commercial or industrial exploitation. So there's two different phases, and that's often important in the way ABS legislation is set up, a discovery phase and a commercial phase. And so there's different obligations under those different phases. So the discovery phase, the obligations are a little bit simpler. They're not as complicated. The commercial phase is clearly more complicated, and there's more expectation of significant benefit sharing in the commercial phase. But it's just interesting to note that they've taken a utilization approach to the temporal scope. So new types of utilization, new types of bioprospecting, even if it's on existing genetic resources, might trigger this regulation. Next slide, please, James. The Namibian law is another interesting one to look at. I've actually said the bill here, but this bill was passed in 2018, I think. I just couldn't get a new copy. I kept finding the bill, but I believe it is the same. So it's essentially the Namibian government passed the ABS and Traditional Knowledge Bill. It says that a person who intends to access biological and genetic resources in Namibia found in both in situ and ex situ conditions, which is interesting because some legislation doesn't sort of mention both, or parts of such biological and genetic resources, their derivatives, products, including synthetic products. And this is also interesting. We talked about synthetic and digital sequence information in previous weeks. It also mentions derivatives. And it also says, and wherever applicable, intangible components, including genetic information or gene sequences, and associated traditional knowledge must apply for an access permit in a prescribed form. And before carrying out the research. And so this is a very sort of wide scope they're trying to catch everything, basically, the access, the utilization, in situ, ex situ, including synthetic products and including genetic sequence information. So this is probably an example of probably the broadest scope of definition you might have for thinking about access. Now, what it also says is that the prior informed consent of rights holders is also required for access to genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, and benefit sharing for both access and utilization. So in the process, there needs to be a consideration of both access and utilization. So I think in some of the Pacific legislation, this is also the case. It talks about access and utilization. And so benefits must accrue to the concerned right holders as a result of both of those. It can be the same agreement, but it does refer to both access and utilization. Next slide, please, James. It's interesting to look at the Swiss Act and compare it to the European Act. And I know I shouldn't take too long on this, and there's a lot of text there, so obviously you can read this afterwards. The Swiss are not actually part of the EU, but they obviously hold a special, they're within Europe, and they often negotiate alongside the EU in international negotiations. So it's interesting to compare them and contrast a little bit. The law differs somewhat from the EU regulations. What it says is that in the Nagoya Ordinance, it encourages users to voluntarily share the benefits arising from utilization of genetic resources or associated traditional knowledge in a fair and equitable way, even where there is no legal obligation to do so. And I believe this inclusion has to do with the fact that resources have been taken and moved into gene banks that might be then utilized for different new purposes after the Nagoya Protocol came into effect. Or it might apply to other circumstances. So they're basically encouraging the fair and equitable sharing of benefits, even if, for example, a country may not have ratified the Nagoya Protocol, for example, but resources are being taken from that particular country. So there seems to be an attempt to encourage best practice and voluntary benefit sharing in the Swiss law, which is really interesting. I think that's a really interesting approach. Next slide, please. And also, I thought I'd come back to the traditional knowledge question. So the EU takes a different approach to the protection of traditional knowledge because the Nagoya Protocol doesn't really define associated traditional knowledge. The EU limits its protection by defining it as traditional knowledge held by an indigenous or local community that is relevant for the utilization of genetic resources, and that is as such described in the mutually agreed terms applying to the genetic resource. So it's really narrow in scope in terms of applying to the utilization of a genetic resource. So it really narrows down on that particular fact that there has to be mutually agreed terms related to the genetic resource to take into account the traditional knowledge. If we compare this to South Africa, traditional use or knowledge refers to customary utilization or knowledge of indigenous genetic and biological resources by an indigenous community, et cetera, including their practices. It includes discoveries about the relevant indigenous genetic and biological resources by the community or individual. So it's a really broad scope of traditional knowledge that they've used in South Africa. And there's pros and cons to having a really broad definition, because that sometimes the breadth can be ambiguous. But then in the case of South Africa, they have many different communities and many different concerns about this. And so that's why they've gone for that broad focus on having PIC and benefit sharing requirements for this broad scope of associated traditional knowledge. Next slide, James. I think that might be one of the last slides. Yeah. So I've just got a few links there. Natural Justice, who some of you have met in previous workshops, some of the colleagues from there have a paper on this. And there's a number of different links there that might be useful for you, including the links to the legislation from the different countries. But yeah, I thought this would be a useful short discussion just to reflect upon the different, the importance of the language in setting up your access and benefit sharing legislation in terms of thinking about access, utilization, genetic resources, but also the scope within those terms. And also sometimes the scope of the term bioprospecting, because I know some countries in the Pacific have also used that term. I think that'll do for now. Thanks very much, everyone, for your patience and for your attention. I'll hand over to Rahul and James.
Thank you, Daniel. James, would you want to try playing the video again just before we finish this session?
Yeah, Amanda's going to organize that for us.
Happy 10th birthday, Nagoya Protocol. Less than a year after the Nagoya Protocol was adopted at October 29 in 2010, funding of the European Union enabled the ABS initiative in partnership with PrEP and the University of New South Wales to start promoting the implementation of ABS in the Pacific region and on a national level. Together, we have organized regional workshops, training courses, promoting exchange and awareness raising in the region. Here are the main activities. Based on stock-taking missions, we have supported the ratification process as well as the development of national roadmaps, policies and regulatory frameworks of Pacific Island countries. Some of them have already ratified the protocol, namely Fiji, Marshall Islands, FSM, Palau, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Vanuatu. Others are still in the process, such as PNG and Cook Islands. The related ABS initiative support encompassed commenting on ABS regulations, policies, and traditional knowledge laws and ABS agreements. Apropos agreements, it's very satisfying to hear from participants that the training courses on mutually agreed terms, in short, MAT, have been very helpful with a lasting effect on putting the Nagoya Protocol into practice. Countries also outlined that the ABS initiative case studies and industry sector profiles were very helpful. The case studies were finished and regularly used as positive examples for the achievements of ABS. Patent landscaping is another very specific, while important topic. In 2019, the methodology of patent landscaping was presented to the region by Professor Daniel Robinson. Country delegates were trained in how to search patents using Patent Lens and the WIPO Patent Scope portals. Local and indigenous communities have been a very specific target group in several countries. Strong focus was on awareness raising. We have translated ABS-related posters for that purpose and videos to Bislama and Pidgin. In Vanuatu and Cook Islands, the ARC-funded project of the University of New South Wales is supporting the development of community protocols since 2018, informed by the ABS initiative and its partner, Natural Justice. Despite the successes PrEP as the executing agency of a regional JEF-funded project and the ABS initiative accomplished together, there are some challenges ahead we need to master. One of them is to encourage ABS-compliant biotrade value chains, as many European and US companies go through local intermediaries. Therefore, there is a need for them to become ABS-compliant. We will continue entering into dialogue with them. Many successes paved the way of the cooperation between SPREP, UNSW, and the initiative. We are looking forward to moving the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol and ABS to the next level. During the pandemic, online, after that, again, on-site. With that, I wish you a successful virtual meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Andres. I think we would like to extend our sincere gratitude to ABS Initiative for the wonderful work that they have been doing for the region. Over the years, there's a lot of work that they have done in partnership and collaboration with SPREP, especially our capacity building work. Dr. Daniel Robinson from the region, as well as Dr. Andres, has been providing all the support and necessary advice that we needed to the SPREP team as well as to the country. So thank you so much. Before we go to the next presentation, colleagues, we will just take a few minutes of any questions or any comments on the presentation that was made by Dr. Daniel. Then we'll go to the next presentation, and then we'll hear the countries speak.
Perhaps I might kick off. Dan, thanks very much for your presentation. I'm particularly struck by the Swiss ability to recognise systems in place that precede both the Nagoya Protocol and indeed even the CBD. And that's perhaps partly drawn by their awareness of the International Association, and I'm paraphrasing their proper title, of Botanic Gardens, who take the common policy guidelines first established by Kew Gardens and have applied that to all their holdings going back 300 years. And in essence, if somebody wants to take a plant taken from Samoa or anywhere in the Pacific, even 300 years ago, from the Botanic Gardens say, if you want to commercialise anything that you've done on that plant, you must go back to the country of origin. So it's a condition of their contract that you go back to the country of origin to enter into a contract for access and utilisation of that material. And that's a very powerful exercise, if you like, of soft power. Mm. One of the things that countries can do through the CBD is to raise the importance of that sort of initiative of showing respect for arrangements that support access and benefit sharing flows back to countries of origin for material held outside. It's perhaps easier to get that sort of agreement for non-profit collections, perhaps more difficult for for-profit collections. But it should, the CBD, in my view, should encourage that as a standard of ethical behaviour for ex situ collections. I don't know what you think about that, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I think it's a really great to see that the Swiss have taken that approach, and as you say, following the approach of herbariums around the world. So I'm really pleased to see that sort of language there. It's quite contrasting to what we see with the EU regulations, but I mean, the European countries have a little bit of scope in how they define their national legislation as well on ABS. So there may be some discrepancy within the countries as well within Europe. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Jeff. What we will do now is just kindly asking everyone to switch on their camera so that James can take one photo, and then we will proceed with the webinar. So everyone will switch on their camera so we can have a group photo before anyone steps out, and then we'll take one right at the end. James, you let us know when you're done, taking the photo so we can share.
Yep. Just waiting on a few people to turn on their cameras.
Okay. He still has such a Pacific smile.
Rose, your camera's still off. And Serena, And Vincent, you're still there.
Sorry, I won't be able to show my beautiful face. I don't have a camera.
Oh,
What about Samoa?
are people still doing their hair?
Serena and Rose, you guys there? Okay, I don't think they are at that. We will take one now. 1, 2, 3, and snapshot. Okay, we'll take one more. Okay, one more. 1, 2, 3, smile. I think I got all that. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thanks, James. Okay, so now we will just go to the presentation that I have. James, would you be able to put that presentation? Thank you, colleagues. So we've heard what Daniel said, some of the things that we are doing in different parts of the world, some of the different approaches that we have been taking, that countries have been taking, something that the Pacific can always look into and see what are the options we have and what are the ways we can implement access and benefit sharing, especially to do with TK. Now, my presentation today is more about what we have done in the last few years, what we have been doing recently, and what we are planning to do as we go post 2020. And while I do that, and go to the next slide, please. While I do that, I would like to acknowledge the support, obviously financial support and technical support by our different partners, namely UN Environment Program, which is the implementing partner with the JEF for this current SPREP regional project. Of course, ABS initiative, I've already mentioned. And then we have UNDP. UNDP has been part of the regional project steering committee, as well as they have implemented national access and benefit sharing projects in some of the countries. We had capacity building workshops with the IDLO, International Development Law Organization, University of New South Wales and University of the South Pacific, and Japan Biodiversity Fund, and of course, the Secretariat for the Convention of Biological Diversity. I think there are many other partners and individuals such as JAV, Andreas, and then we have our team at SPREP. They have all provided great support in making sure that the Pacific continues to lead in the region on ABS issues. I mean, look at 10 years back where we were and what we are doing now. In the message that Andreas gave, when we started off, we had first few countries signing up to Nagoya Protocol. Now we have 9. So the numbers are going up. We have legislations brought in by different countries, policies. And so there is a lot of work being done. And behind all this work that we see, there's a lot of effort put in by different organizations and different people. So we'd like to acknowledge that support given by people. Next slide, please. So I will just take everyone to a flashback of what happened in 2010. I think those of us who are here today who were part of that would probably remember. This is in 2010 during the negotiation when we as an organization, the regional organization SPREP, through our comms, we did a Pacific voyage, which kind of helped ensure Pacific visibility. And then our voices were heard at CBD COP in 2010. And we had core partners with SPREP that were working with us, such as SPC, WWF of the South Pacific, Green Pacific, Wildlife Conservation Society, IUCN, Oceania. So all these partners work together with SPREP to ensure that Pacific voice is being heard and there is visibility in terms of the work that we are doing in the region. And of course, we also would like to acknowledge the support that was provided then from GLISPA, the Global Island Partnership, as well as Article 8J from the TNC. Colleagues, I think that event was something that is always memorable. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So, and then during the CBD COP itself, we had the informal consultative group on access and benefit sharing. I wasn't part of the negotiation at that time. I was working for Fiji government, but I was working behind the scenes in the Fiji government to provide all the technical support to our team who were negotiating with the rest of the Pacific. And some of them are here today in this webinar. So that consultation led to a lot of things. Slide. Again, this is part of the meeting that took place, and you know, the tax negotiations, those of you who are familiar with how the COP negotiations take place, intense discussions, and after several years of discussions, the Nagoya text was agreed on. James, next slide, please. This is the moment when finally we came to a consensus. Of course, there was some compromise with the text, but we were able to agree on the Nagoya, and it was formally accepted by the plenary. We go to the next slide, please. Next, yeah, thank you. So this is the slide that we should all look at and see where we have come from. 10 years, 2010, we are in 2020. I am very sorry if I haven't been able to bring the photos of all the countries. Whatever photos I could access, I have put in there. Sorry, I wasn't picking on some specific photos to show, but whatever I could see. So yes, we can see Fiji negotiating team, Vanuatu, Palau. We have PNG, Tuvalu, Cook Islands, Liz. I can see you somewhere as well, negotiating with your colleagues from Palau. And then we had some of the work that SPREP had done in terms of environmental ministers meeting, high-level meeting. We have Stuart Shape doing a special presentation, our comms materials, so our former Director General from SPREP. So basically that picture tells us all the amount of work that was put in while this entire SPREP team was putting behind all the effort to make sure that we are able to implement access and benefit sharing measures. So colleagues, that photo kind of reminds us of where we have come from since 2010. Can we go to the next slide? Now, what happened after that? 2010 is when Nagoya was established. What happened after 2010? 2011 to 2017, we looked at SPREP's role and focus. Soon after 2010 in Nandi in 2011, post-CBD COP that we had, we got all the regional countries back and we had a meeting. We kind of reviewed what happened. And also in 2012, COP11, we had 3 countries that had already signed the Nagoya Protocol, that were Vanuatu, FSM, and Palau. And they were signing the access and benefit sharing. They had shown their interest. Apart from that, our focus in these areas from 2011 to 2017 was on capacity building, workshops, and trainings, as I had mentioned, working closely with partners such as ABS Initiative and other experts from the region. We continued to provide that support to the countries. SPREP continued to have pre-COP meetings and consultations with countries. And we also had provided technical support for COP-MOP. And during the negotiations, my colleague, Ista, the director for EMG at SPREP, is here with us. She has been one of the key faces who had been providing support, and Amanda who's the biodiversity advisor. So all our team had been working with countries closely to ensure that countries have a voice at the Conference of Parties and Meeting of Party for Nagoya Protocol. And of course, resource mobilization and collaboration. I think the great example of that is that the countries have a regional project now as part of the resource mobilization plan, and we're working with ABS initiative and UNSW, working with USP. We're trying to maximize whatever resources we have for the region. And we continued to provide technical support and cooperation to these countries. Next slide, please. Thank you. I think from 2017 to 2020 till now, the major thing that I can talk about, or the major outcome that I could talk about, is the achievements that we have got from the Access and Benefit Sharing Regional Project. So we've assisted 4 new ratifications of the Nagoya Protocol. Palau had signed the protocol when the project came on board. We have assisted and facilitated whatever requests came through Palau to ratify. Solomon Islands, Tonga, and Tuvalu are the other countries. That brings the total of 9 countries that have ratified, and we have about 2 more countries in line to ratify. Hopefully, SPREP is able to quickly get things done, whatever consultations are required in country, to ensure that we are able to ratify anytime mid of next year. The second thing that we have done is the development and approval of the first ABS law in the Pacific for the Republic of Palau. We have worked very closely with Palau to ensure that they are able to present this to their parliament. It was approved. Now they have an ABS Act, the first for the Pacific. And we are working with Palau to now formulate their regulations. We are working with the country in terms of the comments and some minor amendments and changes. Apart from that, we've also assisted FSM, Fiji, Marshall Islands, Samoa, Kiribati, Vanuatu, and Cook Islands in terms of their legislations or policies that they are formulating. We've also assisted countries such as Palau, Fiji, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Cook Islands, and Vanuatu by doing national workshops, capacity building, and one-to-one meetings, and doing country visits. Where possible, we have also developed roadmaps, such as for PNG. I'm sure Rose would be talking more about that today. And my colleague Ofa, I should probably acknowledge her contribution to this work. She's now still with SPREP, but moved to another division. But she had been working very closely with countries in preparation of 5 drafting instructions on development of ABS laws for respective countries, especially Fiji, Cooks, Palau, and Tonga. And we have continued to foster partnerships and initiatives such as working with GIZ Initiative, Japan Biodiversity Fund, International Development Law Organization, UNDP, IUCN, USP, SPC, and UNSW. And then also the project successfully developed the ABS roster of experts and regional training assistance. The project had developed a web page layout for the ABS project dedicated page. So the roster of experts is available on our website. It's got a list. It's a list that we are continuously upgrading. So if countries request some technical help, we always refer to our roster. And one example is that recently we received a request from Samoa. So we've looked through their legislation, some of the support. We are parking that. As soon as we get a confirmation, we will then circulate their request to our roster. So that's the process. We receive a request from the country and then we circulate it to the roster of experts. And the project has got some funds to assist on this. Can we go to the next slide, please? The next one is the major work that we have done on capacity building. I think this is something that we continuously receive requests for from countries. So capacity building is something that is not just one-off thing. It is a continuous process. So, but of course, the target, the audience keeps changing while we are focusing on government agencies. We are mindful that it's not just the government. We need to bring in the private sector. We need to get the research, academia. We need to get the youths. We need to get the communities on board as well. But how we do that is something that we will look at in more detail as years go by, post 2020. Now, the project has supported the capacity assistance for 14 countries with a total of 16 national capacity building workshops undertaken for 14 countries. And this project also facilitated one-to-one intensive discussions and in-house trainings. The last workshop that we had was in December 2019, as Amansha mentioned in the opening remark. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we were unable to go to some countries this year, although we were having them on the list, but unfortunately, but we will continue to assist them with these kind of workshops in 2021, even if it has to do with remotely holding such workshops. The project also supported the legal and capacity building assistance to Palau by redrafting the ABS bill, and the bill was passed into a law in 2018. Cook Islands, Fiji, FSM, Kiribati, Marshalls, Niue, Nauru, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu are some of the countries that we have had the national workshops in and consultations. And we have also done the scoping studies in terms of identifying what are the gaps, what are the challenges that the countries face, which we need to provide support in. Basically, we developed our capacity building materials in line with whatever scoping we had done in these countries. We also had national workshops, including high-level workshops and dialogue. So we, as a SPREP team, we have gone to different countries, 14 countries we've visited. We've met their either state governors, we've met their permanent secretaries, the CEOs, decision makers, ministers, to make sure that our voice are being heard at that level in terms of ratification, in terms of policy change, in terms of legislative framework, compliance issues, and we continue to do that. There have been 4 regional workshops since the project inception, jointly facilitated by the Secretariat, which is SPREP, United Nations Development Program, IDLO, UNSW, ABS Initiative. This is, as I think Andreas had mentioned and Daniel has also mentioned, this has been on mostly legal training, on contract training, on access and benefit sharing clearinghouse that we have had so far. Can we go to the next slide? So where to post 2020? I think this is my last slide, and I just want to talk about, so we've done a lot of things. I mean, if you look at the list of things that we've provided, they are very brief and very short list. I mean, but we can see the amount of work we've been doing. But where do we go from here onwards? I mean, in terms of access and benefit sharing for the region. So number one priority that we see as is on the legal, technical, and capacity building. As I had said, capacity building, we continue to receive requests from countries. Policy and legislative framework, not all countries have been able to develop their legislation. Some of them are in the process. Some of them are still doing consultations. Some of them need to do gap analysis. And some of the countries haven't really started at all. So what we're doing is we are advising them, let's start from something very simple, just a very brief policy document, and then we'll build that up as we go by. Compliance issues, I think that's something that is of concern for the region, because you see countries, once they become a party to Nagoya Protocol, then you're obligated to take certain measures. One of the key, of course, is the legislative and policy framework. Of course, whatever administrative things that they have in their country can be considered, but then there are issues like reporting. We need to see that countries who have ratified are able to report to the Secretariat. And unfortunately, we did not have a very good record from the last reporting period. Only I think Samoa and Fiji had reported. The other countries, it's not that they haven't done anything. They had prepared their report. I think it's in the draft stage. And SPREP will continue to provide that support so that these countries are able to submit their reports to the Secretariat. Of course, the permitting process and the use of the ABS clearinghouse, we want to make specific more visible on the access and benefit sharing clearinghouse, and how to use the clearinghouse, how to access information, and how to actually upload and update your country information on this clearinghouse. It's a very important tool for monitoring part of access and benefit sharing. I think it helps in reporting. So we will continue to provide that support. And of course, capacity building. In terms of resource mobilization, I think some countries have already showed interest in being part of the phase 2 of the ABS regional project. which we are working with UN Environment now to hopefully have a project in 2020 beyond as a continuation of the current project. Also, we have to look at Jeff, what our realistic expectations are, and also look at other partners or maybe other innovative systems that could help continue the great work on access and benefit sharing that SPREP and the countries are doing in the region. We need to look at collaborations and new partnerships, and if possible, private sector involvement as well. Unfortunately, today in this webinar, we do not have many, or we don't have private sector involvement, but I think it's very important to bridge that gap. We have to bring people on the table, and our role at SPREP, we continue to provide that support to countries and bring different types and different interested individuals and groups and organizations together so that ABS as a whole is an agenda for the region. Colleagues, that's all I have today, from where we came to what we are doing to what we are planning for post-2020. I will probably allow for a few questions before we can move to the next agenda. Thank you.
There's always a risk of talking too much. Rahul, I'm interested in the thematic approach to utilising the clearinghouse, not only in terms of monitoring and reporting, but utilising the clearinghouse as a way of showcasing the Pacific as a safe place to undertake research, a place that provides legal certainty and has removed many of the obstacles that are found in other parts of the world. Is that a part of your thinking about framing support for the utilisation of the clearinghouse?
Yes, I think so. I think it's very important, and it's such a great idea that we are thinking along the similar lines. We probably should have a more detailed discussion on how we're going to do this, because as you see, there is a lot of progress being made in certain countries on ABS, and unfortunately that progress information is not available to the rest of the world on what's happening and what we expect. And of course, I mean, the whole point is that we need to make this a research-friendly Pacific, at the same time making sure that compliance issues are there. I mean, compliance issues are met fully, that we are obligated, that there is legal clarity, that people feel confident to come in this region and conduct research, but then communities don't feel deprived of the knowledge and the resources they have. And I think access and benefit sharing clearinghouse is an excellent tool that can be used for this purpose.
We are in furious agreement.
I just had a very minor comment that I take your point right at the end there about involving the private sector and researchers as much as possible too. I think we've got to keep those discussions going with you know, biotrade type companies, companies that are buying you know, all sorts of things from kava, coconut oil, to manu, nali nut or nangai. There's a lot of interest in products in the Pacific, as well as marine genetic resources and things like that. We do need to think about the private sector and research institutions. It might be the universities too, like USP. So that's a good point, Rahul.
Thank you, Daniel. I think just for the information for colleagues here from the different countries, we were planning to have a biodiscovery forum early this year around July. And unfortunately, we were unable to do that. We tried our best, but then in a COVID situation, basically closed off all the borders and travel and quarantine. So we did not have that. But the idea was that we have some kind of a similar forum where we invite researchers, we invite the private partners as well as government partners. So everyone comes on board and becomes a partnership. So there's a joint ownership of the work that we are doing rather than just pushing from one way. So we'll keep that in mind, and if things normalize, hopefully by early next quarter, we will push for this to have a biodiscovery forum where we can get different stakeholders on board to participate and build that relationship and bring people closer. But thank you, Daniel, for your comment.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, James. I don't know how much I said. Yeah, so what we will do is now we will go to the next part of our workshop webinar today, which is we will go into the country highlights segment. Okay, so we will have Samoa first, followed by Tuvalu, and then we'll have PNG. Serena? Yeah, Serena can speak now for Samoa. I'm not sure whether she's online though. Just the microphone is mute though.
Okay, greetings everyone. Good afternoon. And Talufalava, we do hope that everyone is doing fine in of the COVID-19 instructions we received from Rahu and team. So we didn't provide any PowerPoint presentation, but we're happy to provide more has implemented. I'm also happy to introduce who is also the Nagoya Protocol in Samoa. So in terms of policy and regulating legal instruments, for your information, we developed the Environment Management and Conservation Bill, which includes APS provisions. However, during the APS week held last year, so one of the key recommendations for consideration is the urgent need for Samoa to develop a standalone APS policy to provide legal certainty towards the implementation of APS in Samoa. So with the financial support provided through the UNDP GEF Global APS project, and of course the technical expertise provided by Dr. Burton, Samoa has developed its standalone bill, which is currently in draft form, and it's called Genetic Resources and Associated Traditional Knowledge Management Bill 2020. So to date, we are currently working in close collaboration with our key stakeholders, and of course with the support from our partners such as PrEP and UNDP and Dr. Burton to actually review and finalize the said bill. So in addition to that, we have also developed our national ABS legal framework, where we have identified what has been done through legislative or policy measures to implement the Nagoya Protocol. It also helped us to identify the gaps that we need to address to fully implement our commitments under this protocol. So through the UNDP GEF Global ABS project and the support from SPREP, we've also managed to develop a guideline for access and use of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. This guideline actually provides general guidance and instructions and directions to users of traditional knowledge associated interactions with the local communities. So it is also intended to provide to prevent the misuse of GRs in the future and to foster confidence and cooperation between the users and the providers. So in addition to that, as we have mentioned during the second webinar, we've also developed the biocultural community protocols for the two communities in Samoa. These protocols really identify and defines their history, their identities, their culture, their beliefs, their practices, and it also explains their wishes on how they want to interact with the external actors in the event of access to their traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources as well as their genetic resources. Samoa has also developed our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, or our NBSAP, for the year 2015 to the year 2020, where we recognize the importance of the Nagoya Protocol. And we specified under the National Biodiversity Target 16, with the focus on the ratification of the Nagoya Protocol and developing and adopting supportive national regulations as well as the promoters. So before we became a body to the Nagoya Protocol in 2014, there was already a process in place for research approval. So with this process, when a researcher inquires to do research into the genetic resources of Samoa, the government, through our ministry, provide the researcher with an application form and the list of the requirements for access. So once we receive the completed application form with the supporting documents from the applicants, then we proceed with our normal screening or assessment process. This will allow us to provide our technical assessment to assist our CEO, who is also the focal point to the Nagoya Protocol with his decision on whether to approve or decline the application. But in a case where a local community is involved, then MNRE or our ministry facilitates getting the approval from the communities that will be involved in the research. So if the application is approved by the focal point or by our CEO, then we'll move into establishing the mutually agreed terms, or what we call a letter of agreement. And that agreement has to be signed by all parties before any field surveys or field works is undertaken. So for the educational and awareness programs, since Samoa became a party in 2014, we managed to conduct more than 30 educational and awareness programs for ABS. And these include consultations conducted for the local communities as well as our key stakeholders. In addition to that, we even utilize the opportunities provided during our national events, such as the National Environment Week and Biodiversity Day, to promote APS. And as I mentioned earlier, that we had our APS week towards the end of last year. And just last month, we were very fortunate to receive both the financial and technical support from SPREP to undertake a capacity building training for our staff. This is mainly on the APS process, given that most of our staff involved in the implementation of APS in Samoa are new. So for the reporting and information management, as Rahul mentioned in his presentation, that we have already completed and submitted our national interim report on the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol at the national level. So the launching of this report also occurred during the commemoration of the National Environment Week 2019. And we are also happy to update that our APS database is now at the final stage of development, and we are hoping to have it launched before the end of this month. Given that the APS is a fairly new concept for Samoa, so the local capacity, not only for our ministry, but also our other key stakeholders to implement and to comply with the applications of this protocol is a real challenge. So in addition to the very limited number of staff allocated to work full-time for the implementation of APS at the national level. One of the key challenges that we face is the coordination. There's always a lack of coordination between various agencies and ministries on issues related to APS. So we need to strengthen that coordination between our key stakeholders. In terms of funding, of course, it's always a challenge. Where we have a very limited financial support available to fully implement our commitments and our applications for the Nagoya Protocol. One of the key challenges that we have identified from our previous cases is the monitoring of users to ensure that they are comply with what is set in the mutually agreed terms or the letter of agreements. So, and we've also identified that there's a great need to have, other government ministries and our key partners involved, especially our research institutions, through building their capacity to actually identify their roles and their responsibilities towards the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol in Samoa. So that's all we can say for now, but if my colleague Antole has something to add on. Okay, so that's all from our end.
Thank you, Serena, and thank you, Ntole, as well, for your wonderful presentation and talk about the work that Samoa has been doing. I think for the entire Pacific, if we look at it, Samoa has done really well in terms of implementing access and benefit sharing. There are great things that you guys have done. A lot of work, a lot of thinking behind how you like the approach of doing an ABS week or ABS day celebrations, and your communication materials, your consultations has always been great. So thank you so much for sharing those wonderful things that you've been doing in your country with the rest of the Pacific. Is there any other comments on Serena's presentation before we go to the next speaker?
I can truthfully say working in Samoa is always a pleasure.
Thank you, Jeff. Just same for me as well. I would just make it a little bit more interesting. Working with someone is always a great pleasure. So we'll go to the next speaker. Thank you, guys. We'll go to the next one. I think we have Tuvalu. Is there anyone from Tuvalu that's going to speak? Tilia is there? James?
No, I don't think Tilia is on.
Okay, so we'll go to PNG. Rose.
Rose is on, but she's not responding. Hi, Rosie, are you there?
So while we're waiting for Rose to speak, we also had a confirmation from Warwick Harris from Marshall Islands. Unfortunately, last minute something came up. He has another important meeting that he has to attend to, so he's given his apology. We also had a confirmation from USP, Chuape, but I don't think so. He's online here. So, but we haven't received any message. Maybe he'll join us later. I'm not sure. And also Tuvalu, we had a confirmation, but we don't see them online. So unfortunately, we had about 4 countries out of the 2 were unable to make. But we'll still go ahead and see if PNG Rose is available to speak now.
Rose is trying to connect to her audio. Earlier, she mentioned that she's having issues with her microphone, so I think she's trying to work that as well. Yeah, she's just messaged us that she's having a problem with her microphone.
Yeah, so maybe we'll just give her a few minutes just to see if she can fix her audio issues. Otherwise, I think we're coming towards the end of our program today. We had Daniel speak, and after that I did a short presentation, and then we had Samoa as well sharing their example of the work that they've been doing in the country. Maybe at this moment, I will just open up the floor generally for all other participants to speak. If there are comments, or if maybe I can see Liz is there and she's quite active. So Liz, would you like to just say a few words about the work that you've been doing in Cook Islands, and of course share us some of the things that you like to share with the rest of the Pacific? You have been part of the negotiations of the CBD COP during the time when Nagoya was established. So I'm sure you have some good messages for all of us here.
Okay, hi everyone. Hi Raul. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to say something. I don't really have much to report back about the Cook Islands. At the moment, we're still doing consultations with our national environment policy in the Outer Islands. And we've just come back from 3 of the islands last week, and we've had positive response to the policy, and also to the section on access and benefit sharing. There was a lot of positive response there. In terms, can everyone hear me?
Yes, you're fine, Liz. Go ahead.
All right. I just got a message.
Sorry, Liz, but we can't hear you.
Yeah, so we had quite a good response from the 3 islands in the Outer Islands. So we in that section. So we're looking at going to the north next year to take the environment policy there. So hopefully we'll get more positive response in the ABS section. In terms of in the region, I think it's been a challenge trying to make people understand what access and benefit sharing is all about. I think they're still getting confused between what can go under ABS and what shouldn't be under ABS. And I think it's working closely with the other agencies, particularly agriculture, to identify what areas under the agriculture and that will come under ABS or and things like that. So yeah, that's all we've been doing. I think that's all I have for now, and we'll come back later on if I have anything to say.
Thank you, Liz. I'm not sure if Rose is ready now to speak. Rose, do message us once you are ready. Colleagues, maybe I can also see that we have a colleague from CBD, Secretariat, if it's like to speak and just to make a small remark.
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to just say a few words. And thanks for inviting us to participate and be able to see what's actually happening underground in the Pacific. Maybe I would just like to echo what's been said regarding the ABSCH. As you're aware, the Abs Clearinghouse is well, yeah, it's basically where all countries are invited, and where our parties are requested to submit any updates they have on their ABS legislations, but also any things of interest, where so that all parties but also stakeholders can get easy access to this information. So I would encourage any country or any party who has anything ready to share to actually put it there, just to make it more available and visible. I think there seems to be a lot of really interesting things happening, and we are here also, like the ABSCH and the ABS team at the CBD, to support parties and countries, and to making sure that this information can be easily accessible. So we're happy to if anybody has questions, to organize meetings, distance meetings, of course, and provide any kind of support and uploading or putting any kinds of information on the ABSCH.
Thank you. I'm not sure if Rose is able to speak now. Shall we just give a last try?
Hi, Rahul. I think Rose has messaged to me that she still cannot get her microphone work.
Okay, so
she will share.
Yeah, so maybe
she will share her presentation with us on email, and then we can circulate that to.
Okay, sure, no problems with that. So colleagues, that would mean that we are wrapping up the session for today. But I would like to thank everybody. I will just request if any of my colleagues from the SPREP would like to say anything before we close off the session.
Rahul, I'm just wondering, I can see John Huri is there from Vanuatu, and I know Vanuatu has a Traditional Knowledge Act, which is quite recent. I think at the start of this year, it went from a bill to an act. I'm just wondering if John could give us a quick update about what stage that's at, if John Huri is still there.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Daniel. Yes, John, please, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Yes, we have a TK and BC bill now. We just work on the appointment of the members of the authority, which is now with the state law to pass it. So hopefully we will set up the secretariat next year. Work on all this. I think that's the latest update on what we're doing at the moment. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we are working on setting up the TKNEC authority, which will work together with the Parliament of the APS issues.
Okay. All right. Is there any other final comments before we finish off for today's webinar? No? Okay, colleagues. So once again, I would like to thank everybody who has participated in today's webinar. I think it would have been a very useful one just to see what are the options that we have in terms of looking at different different approaches that has been taken from the presentation that Dr. Daniel shared, and then what we have, I mean, from where we have come to what we are doing to what we plan. The presentation that I had done, and then followed by that we have had some of the country experience from Cook Islands, from Samoa, and also from Vanuatu. BNG will share their experience and some of the information on email, and James will circulate to everybody. But I would like to once again thank everybody for their time and for being here today to participate in the third and the final webinar for this year. We will try to have more webinars next year, and we'll also work with countries to probably do their national workshops remotely, something that we'll have to talk to countries on one-to-one basis. But that's what we are exploring at. So please just have a discussion amongst your team on how we can do this. Maybe facilitate these sessions in the future, especially next year when we come and things are still the same, where the borders are still closed. Finally, I'd like to thank our partners, our donors, as well as our officials, those who are handling the portal today for us to have this webinar, James, Amanda, and of course, Daniel for getting that partnership approach with us and always coming on board to help us out. So colleagues, thank you so much, and have a good weekend and Christmas, New Year, and we'll see you hopefully in 2021. We'll have more things to do with ABS.
Take care, all.
Thank
Happy
you.
Christmas.
Thank you, Sprep.
Lovely to see your faces.
Thank you to all the countries as well. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
And Merry Christmas too, if we don't see you.
Absolutely.
Holidays.
Okay.
Okay.
Happy holidays. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Colleagues, there's a recorded video for this which James will share on the website. So if you want to go back and listen to the presentations, it's always available.
Okay.